Multi-level marketing scheme. No, multi-level classes. Folks, how do we do it? How do we teach to a class that has a bunch of different students, a bunch of different abilities, and do it in a way that doesn't make anyone feel picked on or left out and everyone taken care of? It's impossible, but yet it is our calling. So in this video, we're going to look at it, my favorite tips and techniques for helping you to teach to a wide variety of bodies in one class. Okay, first of all, I just want to lay out that teaching a group class is different than teaching a private. You cannot cater to each person individually. But what we can do is something that I like to call best practices. Now, best practices are where we basically are making the best of a challenging situation. It means that we give cues that are going to be universally relevant for as many people as possible. We balance teaching in an accessible way with teaching in a challenging way and giving everybody something to work on. So I just want to let you know that sometimes as teachers, don't we take on like everyone has to be happy, everyone has to have the best class ever. I'm just here to tell you that in a group class that's all levels, there's going to be some things we can't do. We don't have the time and we can't give each student individual attention. But there are some strategies that we can use to make it a great experience for everybody. Okay, tip number one, and this one is a basic one, you guys, and probably goes for any class you teach, but we want to use accessible language. Like if a student comes into your class and you're like, hello, namaste, today we are theming about the Taittiriya Upanishad and the koshas of the body and blah, 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 and Virabhadrasana 2 and Parivrita Parvakonasana. People are gonna, woo, we've lost everybody. So we want to use language that is accessible and friendly and everyone can understand. Don't need a PhD in Sanskrit in this class, folks. Make it accessible and warm and friendly so everyone gets it. And if you want to use the Sanskrit names for the poses, which I love, just use the English as well, right? Say Warrior 2, Virabhadrasana 2. That way, people feel included, people get a little Sanskrit education, everybody's happy. And this accessible language also goes for our crazy yoga cues. Guys, we say some stuff in yoga class which does not make sense. Draw your front ribs in. Press your upper inner thighs back. These are things that someone who's just coming in hot off the street as a newer yoga practitioner may not understand or have any idea what you mean. So define your terms. As a best practice for your classes, the first time you give a funky cue like press your inner thighs back, show them what you mean. Take their hands to their thighs, say, hey, deepen these hip creases, press the thighs back like you're, sending a Pez. You're a Pez dispenser and you're sending that little Pez candy to the back of the room. Roll your inner thighs in, tip the pelvis forward. Give them all of those explanations the first time you say it, so that then when you do it later in class, people at least have a recollection of what you meant. Soften your ribs in. That can confuse a lot of people. Have them take their hands to their ribs and say, hey, move your ribs towards your navel a little bit so that your abdominal wall becomes a little bit more contained and you feel like your ribs are actually moving a little bit more back and wide and apart. Some of those cues still may be a little too subtle, but at least you've given everybody, the landscape here. We're not leaving anyone behind by using cues that might be challenging to understand. My next big tip, and this is a big one, you guys, and this is one we should definitely try to do, is stage your poses. When you look at your sequence, because of course you plan your sequences, you can kind of pick out the poses that are going to be challenging, or even the poses which might have multiple expressions that are suitable for different people. Well, go ahead, plan them out. But here's the distinction. When you offer a next stage of a pose, rather than say something like stage 2 is, or the next stage is, or if it's part of your practice, do this, because we'll talk about that phrase in a bit. Instead, give them a real clear benchmark on why they should either stay in the one they're doing or why they should go to the next one. Let me give you an example. Say we're doing side angle pose, okay? And I start off everybody with their forearm on their thigh, taking their top arm up, awesome. Rather than saying, hey, if it's part of your practice or if you can, take your hand to the outside of your foot. If you say that, everybody who's like a type A in your class is going to try to do it. And everybody who is a little bit more nervous about it is going to stay where they are. So we want to give them something that's an objective measurement of why or why not they should go to the next stage. Something like, hey, if you've got lots of space between your ribs and your thigh, then take your fingers onto a block to the outside of your knee. If you still have lots of space between your rib and your thigh, take your block down a level. These kinds of things. I made it something that's measurable. Also, when you're teaching different levels in the class, it's a really good idea to empower the place that people are at. Say, hey, if you're here, work on finding that lift in the rib, that nice strong obliques, and finding the breadth of your chest. That's it. That's awesome, right? Empower the place that students are so they don't feel like they're missing out if they don't move to the next place. Does that make sense? That's kind of what we want to do. We want to make it all awesome. And then when we're offering stages, to give really measurable benchmarks so that students know when and if and how they should go to the next stage. This requires a little bit more planning on our part, but it's worth it because then our students not only have something that they can do and feel good about, but also we're educating them on what the next place is that they may want to go or the next action they have to work on to get there. And just as a side note, I personally dislike the phrase, if it's part of your practice. If it's not part of their practice, who's going to teach them? You are. So instead of saying if it's part of your practice, come up with something that's more specific or figure out how you can teach them that thing, right? Sometimes if it's part of your practice or if you're comfortable, becomes a little bit of a cop-out because we're not being specific as teachers. So it's kind of a next level call to action, woohoo, to elevate our teaching so that we can help our teachers or our students see their way through to the next place of their practice and figure out what they need to work on to get there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about working the room. So now that you have a sequence, check your sequence, make sure it's accessible for lots of levels, have options in there that will appeal to different students. Okay, you're gonna have, depending on the class you're teaching, you might have students in there who are advanced who just love doing their own thing. Just let them. If they love doing their own thing and they wanna do a handstand into Uttanasana, into crow, whatever they're doing, great. We'll put them in the back so that other people and beginners are not distracted or discouraged by that, right? And you can also create a friendly environment for people to workshop those things if they want to by saying clearly at the beginning, hey, this is a multi-level class. We're going to have lots of different bodies in here and lots of different shapes happening. Use it as a teaching point. Focus on your own practice, right? But you can create room for that without necessarily enabling or teaching to it. Something to know. That said, as a caveat, I never hesitate to pause someone from doing something that I'm not teaching if it's dangerous or distracting to themselves or others. Our first responsibility as a teacher is to protect the whole of the space, to hold space for all the students in there. So if something's going on that's particularly distracting, you do have the wherewithal to put a pause on that or to shift that experience. Let's talk about walking through the room and teaching the practice. So generally speaking, when you're teaching, you're not teaching to the most beginner people in the room and you're not teaching to the most advanced. Teach to the middle. And I teach to the middle by offering common sense modifications and starting with those modifications and then offering other stages that might be a little bit more complex and making sure that everybody has something to work on. This is especially important when you get to your peak. You don't want people just sitting around and going like, wow, I wish I could do crow. Plan in advance, you guys. Get a first stage that everybody can do that's active and engaging and empowering. You always want to make sure that everyone in your class has got something to chew on that isn't like, oh, we'll sit down and take child's pose if you can't do that, right? Crow pose, give them Navasana, right? Get them to squeeze their legs in. Get something that suits the action of the pose that everybody would be able to do safely. When you're actually walking through the room and cueing to people, it can become tempting to put out fires. You know what I mean? You're like, oh gosh, they're new. Woo! Here's the thing. If you're teaching a group class and not a beginner workshop, I mean, you're going to have to allow for a little bit of chaos, just a tiny bit, right? You're going to have to keep an eye on to make sure that people aren't going to hurt themselves. But if someone is newer to the practice, it's going to take them a while to just figure out what Warrior 2 is, right? So if you find yourself wanting to correct or assist or support somebody more than like 3 times, as a teacher, I say, pull back. pull back those good intentions. Instead, it can be really useful to turn our attention to our advanced students who actually may not get a lot of attention because they look like they know what they're doing. So just notice how you're spending your time. Or you're a teacher who might love your advanced students and neglect some of your beginners. So just kind of watch yourself and distribute your attention evenly through your students. Make sure you're not treating somebody as like either a problem child or the gifted child that you want to fawn all over. It's time to check ourselves and make sure that we are holding space for everybody in the room. Get to everybody. If you're someone who does verbal assists or hands-on assists, get to as many people as you can. And remember that engaging with your students doesn't always have to be a constructive criticism. Sometimes we think verbal assists need to be like, to fix something. But it could be like, John, yeah, way to get down in that warrior two. Awesome, man. That's great. That's still engaging with John, telling him that I'm seeing him, knowing that I'm in the room with him as a teacher, and acknowledging what he's doing. If you give verbal assist in your class, just remember, you can give positive verbal assist too. It doesn't always have to be constructive. Finally, here's a really great practical way to kind of accommodate a lot of different levels. What you can do is you teach the first time slow. The first sun salutation, you break it down, you show all the modifications, you do all the things, you talk about the risk factors. First time you're into Warrior 2, you talk about the risk factors, you break it down, you give a little bit more instruction. And then as you move through the practice, you're able to touch on those poses more quickly and move at a pace that, might be a little bit more flowish or whatever. But if you teach the first time slow, at least then you've given the newer students in your class the opportunity to understand what they should be looking for or feeling in each of those poses. So that can be a really nice way. First time through, just slow it down, go slow. I find that for me personally, moving more slowly in my practice is actually more challenging. So the benefit of moving a little bit more slowly the first time through too is that your advanced students may have a little bit more time to refine their alignment and work on the stuff that they need to work on. Everybody wins. So there you go, everybody. There's some tips and tricks for working with a multi-level class. It is the name of our game these days that most of us are teaching multi-level classes. So those are some ideas for how you can take care of everybody. And remember, ultimately, yoga isn't about being able to create like the ideal epitome experience every time. It's about cultivating a practice for our students over the long term. We're never going to be able to teach everything in one class, even though we desperately may want to. So as a teacher, I just want to give you some context to give yourself a little bit of a break. Teach what you can, keep an eye on the room as a whole, and create a positive class experience, and that's what'll get people coming back for more. So there you have it. If you have any suggestions or thoughts or comments, please put them in the chat below. I love to hear from you. Thank you so much for being part of this community, and I will see you on the mat.